Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. A couple of quick things on my end, just to make sure. Can you all see my screen? If you can see it, just give me a thumbs up or an emoji in the. Okay. All right. Thank you. I think yep. Thank you. And you all can hear me okay? All right. We'll get started in the interest of time. Thank you all for joining us today. I assume you're all here in the right space for a presentation webinar on the Minnesota African American Family Preservation and Child Welfare Disproportionality Act for non-phasing counties. Um, Glad you all are here. Hopefully you all find this informative and helpful in your work in your respective counties. We've got an hour slated here. I'm going to move on to the next slide real quick so you can see the agenda here. Oops, just click my button here, sorry. I can figure out how to do it here. Let's try this button here. I've got several screens, so I gotta make sure I'm on the right one. There we go. So we will go over a little bit of the history of this bill, just for some context. I think it will help understand where we're going with the phasing work, and then we'll get into the most recent bill that passed last year, so under that context as well. We'll go into the phase-in work, and then a little bit about the statewide working group, and then leave some time for questions. I do have two colleagues here, Kia Moore and Sarah Shepard, who are monitoring the chat as well. So as we have conversation and dialogue and go through the presentation, if you all have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. We will leave time at the end for questions too, as well, but just feel free to put them in the chat if you want to, or just write them down in your own notes, and then we'll leave some time as much as we can at the end to go through them as well. We've got a couple questions that came in before the webinar as well that we'll go through and answer, in addition to the ones that you guys provide in the chat. So that being said, I'll just give a brief introduction to who I am. I do recognize a few names on here from my time here, different capacities in DCYF and from DHS. My name is Devin Gilchrist. I currently work in the African American Child Wellbeing Unit, Child and Family Wellbeing Unit. I've been in that position for 5 years, and prior to that, I was working in DHS as our foster care policy specialist, and before that, working in our quality assurance area doing our children and family services reviews across the state of Minnesota. So happy to be here, happy to join you all. So we'll start with a little bit of a history of the bill. You'll hear some different terms used throughout this presentation. I'm going to try to do it historically speaking. So this bill, as many of you all may remember, initially was first called MAAFPA, which was the Minnesota African American Family Preservation Act. And so it's changed over the years, and different iterations and revisions of this, but I want to give a little bit of history of kind of how we got here to give some context, some level setting as well. So MAAFPA was first introduced in the 2018 legislative session. It was then called MAAFPA, as I mentioned. It was modeled similarly to some of the provisions around the Minnesota Indian Family Preservation Act, which is MIFA. That included requiring active efforts, prevention grants, and also a council to provide insight and guidance. The broader purpose of the 2018 MAAFPA bill was to protect the best interests of African American children, and also to promote the stability and security of African American children and families by establishing minimum standards to prevent arbitrary and unnecessary removal of children from their homes and families. That version of the bill consisted of about 11 sections, which had a focus on active efforts, preventing placement, prevention and termination of rights, local agency conduct as well. It would have established an African American Child Wellbeing Department, which would have consisted of 5 staff members, and also would have established an African American Child Welfare Oversight Council as well. And then lastly, it would have established African American Child Welfare grants to provide support for African American children and programs to implement the act as well. The provisions of that legislation at that time would have been exclusively to African American children and no one else. The bill did not receive a hearing in the 18th session and did not advance. In 2019, it got a hearing, but did not advance. It was largely unchanged between 19 and 18. In the 2020 session, it also did not move forward in the session. At that time, CSP within DHS also developed a proposal for the 2020 session to address African American child overrepresentation, but that bill was not exclusive to just African American children and families. It was basically open to any particular demographic that was overrepresented in the system. The proposal was drafted to work in concert with the spirit and intent of the previous efforts to advance early versions of MAAFPA, which had been successful at that time. Those included provisions consistent with establishing staff to focus on disparity at a regional level, developing an advisory council, providing funding for prevention grants to reduce supporting reduction of system involvement and disparities. It also had additional funding in that bill for allocations for PSOP dollars, support for minor parents, and also for homeless youth. And there were also a couple policy components of that bill in 2020 to strengthen requirements to engage relatives and also change the standards to remove barriers to licensure um, regarding background studies and whatnot. So those last 2 points did pass, and I believe the 2022 session as well. So they actually are in policy now and in statute. So as both in 2020, as both the DHS proposal and MAAFPA did advance, our leadership here in CSP explore options to use fundings to kind of move the work forward at least a general level as well, with greater intentionality and purpose. At that time in 2020, we established resources to create a permanent African American child and later renamed family well-being unit as well. In 2021, MAAFPA was introduced again in the session. It did receive 2 hearings, but did not advance in the session again. After that version of MAP did not pass, our division also sought additional opportunities to expand the work of the African American Child and Family Wellbeing Units through other resources, which added other staff to the unit and also allowed us to then create an African American Child Wellbeing Advisory Council. In 2022, because MAAFPA had received 2 hearings, it remained alive in the legislative process from that year, but it did not advance in the session again. And then in 2023, it was not introduced and there was no action taken on the bill in that session at all. So it kind of lay dormant for a year. And that brings us to 2024. So again, we introduced 2024. It was also known as the Layla Jackson Act at that time. Then it was called the Minnesota African American Minnesota African American Family Preservation and Child Welfare Disproportionality Act, also called MAAFPCWDA internally here. It was also expanded to include other disproportionately represented groups and was not exclusive to African Americans. It still maintained many elements of the previous version of the bill, but also added some other elements with more of a focus on oversight. That included increased case reviews at both the state and county level, additional monitoring and reporting requirements, and also a phasing program for Hennepin Ramsey with an opt-in option for other counties at the request. I would say in comparison to other years, I would say that we saw much more, I think, conversation internally about 2024's version of the bill than previous years. Again, this is not a bill that we wrote or introduced ourselves. It is an external bill that we were presented with from legislative authors that came from community advocates, and that we always in those situations, we at DHS and DCYF always remain neutral on external proposals, with the exception of if that bill or proposal has significant negative impacts on the public, or if that bill is included in the governor's budget. So we remain pretty neutral. I will say that having been involved in this process for the last 6 years, and watching this last year, our staff, leadership, legislative staff, our key policy and practice staff spent significant time and effort engaging internal conversations with amongst ourselves as an agency, and also engaging external dialogue with the legislative authors and community advocates about this bill to try to find some ways of finding concessions, compromise to move something forward in some feasible, passable way as well. So in that process, we gave extensive assistance, technical assistance on the bill as well. And so that's when we often offer to the bill authors language to make things clearer, to make sure they're in alignment, to make sure things are not contradictory, not out of the scope of the agency or the practice, also not potentially impacting current policies or laws, and also not illegal as well. And so the goal of that assistance is always to create better alignment with existing statutes and laws and language so it's clear and there are no adverse legal or practice contradictions or issues that exist, and give the bill the greatest chance to being passed and successfully implemented in the future as well. So we gave a lot of assistance on that bill. We don't control if a legislator wants to take the language we suggest. They can certainly do if they want to or not do it. We always try to offer that language to them to make sure they have the ability to see and get guidance and assistance on the bill as they try to pass it through the legislative process. Right. So the bill passed and was signed into law in May of 2024. The bill applies to African American and other disproportionately represented children based on 5 key demographic criteria. That is race, ethnicity, culture, disability, and low income status. As you all are probably aware, there is a phase-in program that began on January 1 of 2025, both for Hennepin and Ramsey. Both counties are doing what I would call a graduated phase-in process, which I'll explain a little bit later on in the presentation. And then, of course, in 2027, January 1, the law will be implemented statewide at that point in time. We at the DCYF certainly are aware and recognize that the implementation of this bill requires significant collaboration and reporting between ourselves, counties, courts, the community, and legislature as well. It'll be an ongoing process going forward. Another key provision of the law is that it then codified both our African American Child Wellbeing Unit and the council in statute as of July 1. So the existing unit and council that we created in 2021 were then codified in statute as of July as well. And those are the 2 statutes that you can find them under. Those statute details their duties for both the unit and the council. So that brings us to kind of the phase-in program. So again, the phase-in program consists of Hennepin and Ramsey. It was initially proposed in the 2024 language as a pilot and later reconceptualized as a phase-in program as well. It was effective January 1 in Hennepin and Ramsey. As I mentioned before, other counties could certainly choose to opt in at their request. At this point in time, none have formally opted in to that phase-in program. The phase-in program implements sections 1 through 17 of the bill. There is one exception for that phase-in program, that the case review requirements under section 9 that the counties have to do is exempted until 2026 as well. The phase-in includes appropriations for both counties, $2.5 million each for implementation needs and costs, and I'll get that a little bit later on as well, and then $500,000 each for community-based prevention grants too, and I'll discuss that in later slides. Both those amounts were set by the legislative authors and not DCYF or DHS, so we didn't control or set those amounts on our part. That's what's already decided by the legislative authors, and we just are charged with implementing that work as is written. And then in January 1 of 2026, our commissioner must report on the outcomes of the phase-in program, including as written, the number of participating families in the phase-in program, the rate of children in out-of-home placements, and the measures taken to prevent placement for each participating family. That's what's required as is written in statute. We, I think, are of the mindset that we probably want to have a more comprehensive report that gives more detail than that, but that's what's required as the statute is written verbatim. Some of the core elements and requirements of the phase-in are county requirements for active efforts and documentation, court requirements for orders, reviews, and hearings, cultural competency training provided by DCF for child welfare workers, also available for court staff, attorneys, guidelines, etc. Requirements for local agency conduct and county administrative case reviews. We have a requirement for DCYF targeted case reviews, which are different. So the case reviews that the counties do have a prescribed set of criteria that they are looking at that is set for all counties. Our DCYF targeted case reviews are a little bit different, that we can kind of decide what we want to look at based off data, trends, patterns, things we hear in the community, things we hear from workers, to kind of dig into things in a more targeted way at our capacity too. This was designed to be a little bit of a compromise from the initial proposal that was put forward last year, where it had required the automatic review on our part, DCYF, the automatic review of every single screening decision, every single placement decision, and every single adopting decision. And internally, as we assessed that request initially, we determined that would have been ideally between 18,000 and 21,000 reviews a year that we had to be doing. And obviously, you need folks to review cases, which requires staff, and staff get paid for salaries, and so that would have been a very costly element of the bill. And so to keep the cost down to support greater chance of passing, we were able to kind of come to an agreement of us pare down the review process a little bit to be more intentional about not making it cumbersome and not making it where that would change the landscape of the bill and make it potentially not passable. So that was the compromise. The bill also requires that we make improvements as a state to our data reporting and disaggregation as well. Those improvements are very, very broad, so we can decide what those are based on our capacity and resources. We are to provide best practice guidance in a couple different areas, practice guides around engaging relatives, maintaining connections, and also a practice guide around engaging non-custodial parents. And we also have to give practice guidance around supporting visitation for kids in foster care. What that guidance is not defined in statute, but it just says guidance. The elements also require us to create a compliance oversight system, and then also create a portal for feedback and complaints regarding broader child welfare elements around screening, placement, reporting, permanency, as well as any specific things around a non-compliance issue regarding MAAFPA CWDA. And then we also just continue to maintain clear communication with agencies as well in the process. And then again, like I said earlier, the council and the unit, and then the appropriation for money as well is in there. So as we're looking to kind of support the internal phasing process, we actually had some discussions internally as a division to kind of prepare us for that process. And so we developed a number of internal committees related to the generalized areas of legislation. Those committees internally within DCYF consisted of a core committee, family preservation, a leadership committee, permanency, placement, and training. What those committees did is they further analyzed the bill areas, determined potential needs, challenges, areas that need further clarity, and other dynamics for us to kind of get ahead of things as we start to engage our county, Basin County partners in conversations. Um, Additionally, the committees were seeking to look for things internally that we could use as foundational practice pieces. So if we had something that was already happening in our area or across practice or policy that we thought could be a foundation to align with the requirements of this bill, with little to no change or maybe some minor refinement or expansion, and let's do that as well to keep it simple and make it effective as well. So that was also their task, is to look at what are those things that might exist that we could build upon that are already in place right now. Our staff met up to 3 times a week internally to plan for the ongoing internal work and the phasing work as well. And that started probably about May or June of last year. And then at that point in time, we started meeting twice a month with both Head and Ramsey together in joint meetings in the summer of 2024. The purpose of the meetings is really to be built on partnership and collaboration, to focus on a shared understanding of the legislative elements and duties and responsibilities of both the counties and the states. We know that this bill has things that are more exclusively the counties, but we have some intersection with that as a state and vice versa. And so we wanted to identify roles and oversight in key areas, such as the definitions, the case review process, the practice guidance, training, et cetera, et cetera. It also looked at those phasing meetings as an opportunity to discuss planning, to share updates, to talk about concerns or challenges and feedback, and to proactively work towards the phase and implementation date of January 1, January 2025, not 27, sorry, as well. So we're just going to get ahead of the game for 25. So we had ongoing meetings with Hip Ramsey County staff. Those staff included their own leadership and management as they chose it. So they chose the folks they wanted to have involved in the conversation on their own end. It also involved many of their court staff, county attorneys, and other individuals, and then other staff that they determined necessary by the county as well. Our staff included our leadership, which is included but not limited to our assistant commissioner, our directors, managers, supervisors, legal staff. It also involved administration, policy staff, and other experts and subjects that were related to the work we're doing as well. So a pretty wide, diverse array of people internally participate in these phasing meetings as well. So in the phase-in meetings, we heard a couple different things that came up, in the conversations we've had for the last year or so, in no particular order of ranking. One thing is the funding. And so as I mentioned, both him and Ramsey get the 2.5 for implementation as well, respectively speaking. There is no prescribed criteria or written limitations as to what that includes. So what the implementation needs are not defined. Some examples could be staff salaries, technology needs, space, office equipment, training, et cetera, but there's not a defined space or defined criteria as to what it could be or what it isn't per se. It's pretty much whatever the county thinks they need to successfully implement this phase in their county as well. And then the other part of that funding is the $500,000 for primary support grants. And I'll just go back and say, we don't know exactly why there's 2.5 for both counties when Hennepin is population-wise is much bigger than Ramsey, so we're not quite sure how that comes to be. It's just what was decided by legislative authors and what we're following. So it's written in that way, and that's what we're following. So there is the $500,000 for this primary support grants, also labeled as Family Preservation Grants in statute, which is 26693. Those grants are largely modeled after the NIFA primary support grants, which are 26795. Those things include, not limited to, but include things like individual counseling, family counseling, court advocacy, prevention efforts for placement, et cetera, as well. So, we were looking to try to find internally, how do we best get this money to the county in the most expedient way we can as well. We know that our typical process of granting is going through an RFP process, having to apply, selection, all that stuff takes time, would have created additional challenges and delays in the funding distribution. So we decided to ultimately just give them the full payment to both counties upfront in advance, rather than doing quarterly periodic disbursement and reimbursement process where we give them a little bit of money, then they spend it, they report back to us, then we give them another bit of money. That would have been very, I think, cumbersome for the counties to use this in a real way. So that was our process, and we're still working through our process right now. What's challenging with funding is just, the protocols and processes that we have in our part regarding contracts and grants, working through legislative language that impacts how we can distribute funds to counties, working creatively within our current granting process, like I mentioned earlier, to find ways to get it to them upfront creatively, and then also just writing the contracts and legal review takes time as well. And then the counties, and it's kind of similar challenges with their process and protocols, their legal reviews and edits, and then getting the county approval. So obviously they have to go through, as you all probably know very well, going through their own legal teams and then getting approval from their board and commissioners and upper level leadership as well is a challenge. So we are working there with both counties at this point in time, but it's been a little bit of a challenge for government systems. Some key areas of focus in our phasing meetings thus far have been definitions. I put a couple of them here. These aren't all of them, but I put a couple that have kind of come up in our discussions as well going forward. And so these are largely taken from 263, which is definitions and some other parts of the bill. One's of those active efforts. There is a pretty, I would say, lengthy definition of active efforts as a definition, but contextually, what does it mean? What are active efforts? What does it look like? How does it feel to workers and to families? That isn't fully defined as well. And then how do you track and document it too? So that's one thing that's come up on a regular basis that we're still working through as well. Disproportionality, there is a definition of it, but how do we know who is overrepresented? The problem is that, again, look at the 5 criteria. We don't track all that criteria in our system. We don't track SWIFT status as a broader thing. We don't track low income as a broader element. We track race and ethnicity in accordance with census data, but we don't track culture either, right? So what does that mean as well? How do we know who actually is represented in the system based on just sheer numbers? And then looking at the criteria again with quantification, looking at what is the definition of culture and disability, and we don't have it defined. How can we know who's represented in the system or not under those parameters? So that's what we're working on, defining culture, disability, as well as some other areas too. Race, ethnicity, even income is a little bit easier to define because it's a little bit more binary, where either you're this or this. But culture and disability are a much broader bucket, and under which many kids may fall in different capacities. Is disability physical? Is it mental? Is it learning? All those things. So there's different definitions of disability that we're exploring right now and trying to get a consensus of what it may be as well, and then how you track those things. And same thing with culture as well. Child welfare has come up quite a bit. So in the bill, I think it mentions child welfare 68 times across the language, but it doesn't define child welfare in definition. What is child welfare? I think we all have different variations and kind of ideas of what child welfare is, but for the purpose of this bill, we need to have some kind of clarity so people know which cases apply or how to apply it within certain cases. So is it CP, is it CMH, is it extended foster care, EFC? Is it PSOP? It's not quite clear in the bill language what they're thinking. We are going back and asking the authors about kind of what their intent was with their language to get a better idea and to better define it, but it's just not defined right now in statute. So it's a point of question that counties are asking to have. And then lastly, life of the case. And so in the definition of active efforts, it says that essentially it's a concerted and rigorous level of effort that workers or agencies will do with children and families throughout the life of the case. Well, what does the life of the case mean? When does the case actually begin? Is it intake? Is it screening decision? Is that when the case opens up? In some ways, in many ways, the way the bill is written, it seems to focus much more on case management, open cases, but certainly that doesn't stop the agency of engaging with relatives and families and procuring certain parts of the bill earlier too, as well, either the intake process or even in the investigation and assessment process as well. But it's not clear what they were thinking about in terms of when they believe the case life begins. So we are working with them, the office, as well, to seek clarity on that piece as well. A big part of this, as you guys probably already imagine, is active efforts, like I mentioned. And so we saw in the phase-in meetings that there was definitely a focus on the need for training for workers on active efforts. As a result, us and our Child Welfare Training Academy work with community members to develop active efforts training. That training was designed to give workers a better understanding of active efforts and increase capacity to provide them to families. We contracted with current social workers, other workers, child welfare workers, and also community partners to be trainers. And then they spent several weeks providing the training to both Hennepin County and Ramsey County workers. I think that started maybe December, January. I'm not quite sure off the top of my head anymore. And then now we're just now beginning to offer these active efforts training opportunities for workers to other non-phasing counties too. And we'll continue that going forward, but we're just starting to do that right now as well. So look at the same training that the Hennepin Ramsey County workers went through as well. The bill also requires that we must collaborate with CJI, we mean DCYF, to ensure that there's cultural competency training that's given to individuals working in the child welfare system. This includes child well-being workers, child protection workers, child welfare workers, and supervisors. The training must also be available to attorneys, juvenile court judges, and also family law judges, which pretty much anybody else in the court system. We are currently working on developing that training. You know, one of the challenges that I mentioned earlier is what does culture mean? And if we don't have a definition of culture, then how do we define or how do we develop cultural competency as well? So we're working to kind of get a better definition of culture to help determine how to best create and construct the cultural competency training as well, so it makes sense and it actually improves our responsive nature of our work in the system. We had a lot of discussions around the definition of disproportionately represented child and the limitations of SSIS to track children demographically across culture, disability, and low income. So as I mentioned before, SSIS does not track those things, so it's hard to determine who's in the system if it doesn't track that. We estimate that this definition of race, ethnicity, culture, disability, and low income will basically cover roughly about 90 to 95% of all kids in the child welfare system as well. But because exercise doesn't track those things, the focus that we had was on what we can track. And so what was proposed was basically a graduated phasing process where they would not start with 100% right away. They would slowly work into their work, a graduated process to start with a percentage of cases, of eligible cases, and move it up each term or whatnot until they get to 100%. And so that's what they're doing as well. The purpose of that is not to create exclusionary measures to keep people out of these services and resources. It's really on their part to make sure they can handle it in a way that makes sense and is appropriate, and that it doesn't fail on their part as well. So it's really done with the intention of being effective long term. And again, the initial focus is on what's trackable as SSIS data-wise, which right now is race and ethnicity, and they're focusing on, for the first part of this phasing process and graduate process, they're focusing on African American, American Indian, Alaska Native, and two more races, and that's based on their systemic overrepresentation in the system. So we continue to have ongoing meetings with both Hennepin and Ramsey as they entered into January 1 and throughout the first 4 months, I guess now 5 months of the phasing process. We continue to discuss some same things, definitions. One definition that came up again, as mentioned, what is child welfare? We've had some discussions around the required county case review process and the need for a tool that they can use together, as both counties to create more consistency and universality around the review process. So that way we're not looking at different measurements and different outcomes for two counties as we can compare and contrast the counties. I'm looking for other resources too for them in the case review process. We've also had some discussion with them about the complaints process and how they would be contacted when we get complaints about specific cases, and those complaints result in us doing maybe a more targeted case review, and potentially having to reach out to counties and having a consultation or discussion too. So our goal is that this complaint process is not meant to be a situation or a space where it feels punitive to counties or it feels like we're coming into, for lack of a better word, late on the law. This is really a space that we want to really work together to partner about cases and about the practice. And if we see some challenges to the practice, let's explore it, together in a collaborative way and find ways to support the county's ability, or the workers' ability, or both, to improve their practice where it seems there's an issue or a need present based on what we look in the cases. So it's meant to be collaborative and partnered, not punitive or judgmental in nature. And then, of course, last ongoing point of the conversation is the funding and the allocations, and just trying to get that through out the front door into the counties as well, so they can begin their hiring, their purchasing of technology, their training, et cetera, they need to be ready for this process going forward. So, lastly, there is a statewide working group that also exists, and so what the working group does at a very broad level is it provides oversight of the phasing program. It helps to evaluate the cost of the phasing program, and then also to assess the cost of the implementation as well for statewide, based off learnings from the phasing program. By January 1 of 2026, the working group has submitted a report to legislature detailing the needs for implementation and recommendations for statutory change or policy that will help with the statewide implementation, as well as the plan for implementation and a best practice as well. So the members have to be, in no particular order, members from MAAFPCWDA, members from AMC, Associated Minnesota Counties, members from MICA, the Minnesota Intercounty Association, MCAA, the Minnesota County Attorney Association, Hampton County, Ramsey County, DCYF, and then also community organizations with experience in child welfare. So those are who's required to be there. The number is not defined in statute, so there's not a criteria for how many of each person from each agency or each place had to be on this working group. We are looking at probably around 25 or so right now. It could certainly change and increase as we move forward, but that's kind of what we're looking at right now, are the numbers. And so they have had one meeting so far, I think last month, just the very first beginning meeting, and they'll continue to meet monthly or even more frequent as they determine to help fulfill their duties as well. And the goal is they'll have a report, initially a preliminary report created sometime in the fall is the goal. And there's a facilitator we brought in, external and neutral, who's helping to facilitate the conversations. The working group meetings are, fall under open meeting law, so they are available to be observed by the public. The public doesn't necessarily have the ability to chime in and participate in the meeting verbally, but they can sit in and watch the meetings too as well. So that's an option for folks who are not in that group to see and hear what's discussed. So that's kind of the phasing work in a very broad nutshell. I didn't want to go too deep into the weeds with just an hour's time. I want to make sure I also gave time for questions as well. Sorry. But that's kind of where we're at going forward. So I will stop. Actually, I'm going to do that one more thing. So we have questions now. I'm going to start with the questions we received in the pre-webinar correspondence as well. And then we'll go to any questions in the chat or folks have on their own as well. The first question is, for those of us who are not social work professionals, could you explain how county services will be required to change? For example, will families receive more hours of the same services, or will they receive totally new services? What I would say is I think it's not really about a change in the services itself. I think what it is about a change in the standards around how you engage families across the continuum of child welfare. And so, there are certain monies that are available for expanding or creating new services that are available, but it's really about the efforts to engage families. As a former worker, I think that a lot of workers do kind of operate in this space between reasonable and active for the most part. Now, what that means, what it looks like in real time, is not defined. There is not really a tangible line, so to speak, between active and reasonable. It's kind of just what it looks like, what it feels like. Example of reasonable might be if I have a father who needs to get the therapy because I've assessed them and there's an issue that he needs to address to make sure he can keep a child safe under his day-to-day care, right? And reasonable might be for me just to give the father a brochure of a mental health organization that he can call himself. That might be reasonable. It's arguable, right? But active might be me sitting down with the father, walking through the brochure with him, sitting down with him when he calls, make sure he does it, make sure he has a bus card to get into the therapy, make sure the therapy is in his area, make sure the therapy schedule works with his schedule, um, making efforts to engage the therapist and get reports and talking with the father about the reports. That might be considered more active, right? I'm just giving an example. I'm not saying this is the end all to be all for all things. That's an example. So really it's about how workers really engage that father with more active efforts. Now, I say that knowing that there are certainly time challenges for workers. Workers have large caseloads, a lot of family needs, and can be challenging. So I'm not saying that that's not going to be a problem or going to be a challenge on their part. I'm just going to give you a broad idea or just visual of what the services might look like in terms of this new legislation as well. And then the second piece is that workers within the document that levers in SSIS as active. And so we've added a tab in SSIS or a way in SSIS to then dictate and designate particular actions as active effort activities as well. So hope that answers that question. Let's see. What are the phases in counties discovering for the number of investigation assessments workers can handle and complete all the requirements? I think it's kind of a two-pronged question. Don't quite know yet the answer fully. We're still kind of talking to agencies and kind of seeing how's it going. I think the second piece of that is that, if you look at the language in the bill and how it's written and what the case reviews really consist of, it's really, to me, clear that it's really focusing largely primarily on open case management things for the most part. But certainly, nothing stops an agency from being creative and trying to apply certain elements of this up front. Certainly, they could. You could apply effort to engage a family in the investigation process as active efforts. You could apply efforts to develop a safety plan in the investigation process active. Yeah, so they could do that as well. Absolutely. So it's hard to say what they're learning so far. We are hearing that at least for sure some county, some parts of the county, I can't say which one, is really making efforts to do this much more upfront as possible as they can. But it's a little tricky, a little dicey, I would say. So we're still learning what their processes are like and how they do it. I'm very curious how they do it upfront, as well, and how they determine who's eligible for these services upfront as well. So what other requirements that need to be completed prior to an out-of-home petition being filed for a child who fits into the criteria of MAAFPCWDA? So a couple things. In statute, I don't recall off the top of my head which one it is the one about emergency removals. So there are some criteria, there's about 5 criteria that have to be included in the petition. I would say it's not much different than what's already there. It's a statement of harm and risk. It's also efforts to safety plan, engage families, et cetera, et cetera. I think the biggest challenge, I think, is when you have cases where there is an immediate risk, right, that happens, and there's an immediate need for placement. The bill language does require an exemption if there is sexual abuse or egregious harm, and then it references egregious harm as defined into, what is it, 260 E dot 05, no, 03, sorry, 03. And if you go to that statute, that references egregious harm as defined in 260C 007 subdivision, I think it's 14. And what that talks about basically is it gives the definition of egregious harm. There are certain things that are, I think, would be clearly accepted or expected as egregious harm, DV, significant physical stuff. But there also is language in that statute that talks about if there's a gross impact or a gross something impact to the parents' ability to provide minimally adequate care for a child. So I think in that definition, a lot of things could potentially be considered egregious harm. So I said to say that I think that if there's a case where you have something like it's not necessarily a case where there's like very clear, very severe physical abuse, there's not sexual abuse, but the totality of the issue is still significant enough that you have to, want the child removed, I think you still can advocate for that under the bill as well. But there are requirements, that being said, outside of that, that counties can do in that space to make sure that it's there. It doesn't give language in the bill about what's required if there is a determined immediate need for removal in terms of language. It doesn't say that I recall in the bill at all. So that's an area that's kind of open for interpretation, but that's what it would say. Are counties finding 45 days enough time to complete the task around MAAFPCWDA if not, is there a plan for extending the days? I think it's the second part of that. I would say I don't know. It's really not clear. This does not really touch on the timelines for investigation. That's more tied to federal, I think, laws. I think what I would say in that space is that, again, nothing stops a agency from engaging in safety planning, at the investigation or assessment phase. But certainly if, you're not ready, if certainly if the case is moving through that process, at 45 days, you made a determination that there is a need for opening a case, but it's not necessarily removal, it's just an in-home case. And that in-home case, and that new worker or that person who takes that case from, a finding and opening to whatever, ongoing, they can certainly then still engage in safety planning, engaging in the family conversations, engaging in finding either family group conferencing or something like that as well. So I think it's not relegated that you have to get all things done in 45 days as a standard. And then last one, are phasing counties describing more or less cases going to keep that? I don't know yet. That we're not quite sure yet. We haven't dug into data enough to see. That's kind of where we're going with the phasing counties. To ask kind of how's it going. We want to give them some time to actually do it and implement it. So it's been about 4 full months now. So I'm looking to have those conversations about kind of what are you guys seeing in your data, and also on our end internally, we're working on developing some data elements and some data platforms we can track similar information on our end to see kind of what's happening, get ahead of it too, and guide the conversation. So right now, we're not quite sure what they're seeing in terms of the impact on the actual cases and families, but that's kind of what we're going to next steps. And I'm gonna stop sharing my screen here, and I want to just go to the chat as well. I know Kia and Sarah are monitoring the chat, so I want to see if there's any questions in the chat that folks have. Or I guess you could also raise your hand too if you have questions too.
Yeah. Kia, were you gonna go ahead?
Yeah,
Okay, go ahead.
just to confirm that, sorry, Devin, people don't have access to chat, but they have access to the Q&A section.
Oh, okay, sorry. Gotcha.
And so all the questions have been funneled there.
Gotcha, thank you.
Nothing to be sorry about here. And so I just want to make sure that we are able to address those questions. And any additional ones that would come up, please feel free to add them to the Q&A section.
Gotcha. I'm going and I see them as well. So we scroll through. Okay. I'll try my best to answer what I can answer. Some stuff is still unknown. There's still something we work out and figure out. And I don't know if this is in order, but I'm assuming it is. Well, actually, I see. I'm gonna go backwards because mine's set up differently. I think I have to filter differently. Let's see. I want to go by who asked them first here. So I'm gonna go down. Oh, quite a few. Oh, all right.
I think the first question, it looks like Devin, is from Alicia.
Okay. Let's see. Okay, don't know yet. I can share that is something we're definitely exploring. I just had that conversation yesterday and today with some of our colleagues that's a real thing that we are aware of, and so we are definitely looking into that. One of our challenges that we, hey, it's two things. And I'll try to be succinct. We certainly want to be aware and mindful of when things come across our desk that are bills and legislative issues that have cost to counties, and we always try to point that out that hey, it'll be a cost to counties. Because it's not our cost per se, we can't always give it a fiscal note or an allocation per se sometimes, but we're aware of that. So I think there's kind of two platforms. Certainly counties on their end can certainly, create, local impact statements and things of that nature to identify the costs they think they'll have for their thing. And then I think because there is, some precedent set by the allocation set for the phase-in that we maybe have the opportunity on our end to maybe also ask for some funds too. Not quite sure. So we're still working that process, but we definitely are aware that there's going to be funding needs and money needed for counties to implement this work, depending on size, population, et cetera, et cetera.
All right, thank you, Devin. The next question is, are the 500K primary support primary support grants just for the phase-in counties or for the state as a whole?
Yeah. So the 500 was actually, $500,000. So it was $1 million that's appropriated. My understanding it's annually. And because the phase-in was just those two counties, we just did it $500,000 a piece to those two counties as a start. But our understanding is that going forward for the statewide, that's annually, but that's $1 million. And so similar to the question below, we're also looking about at our end, how can we make the request to get more funding for counties because they're going to need it as well. And what would the ask be, right? So we're not quite sure how much it should be. But we do recognize that $1 million statewide for these support grants is really not sufficient to support 85 other counties.
All right, thank you. The next one is if the phase-in counties don't use the full $3 million in these 2 years, what happens to that excess?
Yeah, so if they don't use it, they return it to us. Beyond that, I'll be honest, I'm not sure where it goes. I'm not sure if it could be reallocated or not. Not quite clear, but it would go back to our agency, and then they would follow the processes to remedy that as it's set in place. But there's nothing in the language that kind of gives clear authority for us to like reallocate it per se.
All right. The next one is, I believe that there was no fiscal note attached to the bill. Are there any discussions on financial support or adding or trying to add fiscal note next year for non-phase-in counties?
Yeah, I think that's the same question. Yeah, answer. So yeah, I mean, on our part,
Yep.
absolutely. Again, I would certainly encourage counties on their part. I mean, certainly as a non-phasing county, I would encourage you all to certainly work within your processes and your spaces to make sure that the need is brought forward. I think that's also the intention of having MAAFPCWDA representatives and other representatives of other county agencies on the working group to bring that forward, so that way it's not forgotten or underlooked or undervalued as well. So I think that's something we definitely are aware of. We can't physically know what the county needs, but we definitely are making it very known that there'll be needs that counties have around implementation and working toward 27.
Okay, great. Will non-phase-in counties also start with application to race and ethnicity only, or will we be expected to come to full implementation immediately?
Yeah, it's hard to say right now. I hate to say that. I think what we're looking for right now, again, as I mentioned before, we're trying to better define those things, and then figure out once we define them and it makes sense, then how can we create mechanisms either in SSIS to better track those things? And not sure. We know that SSIS is a cumbersome system. We know we have some money and some dollars appropriated to SSIS modernization, and we don't even know if in 2027 that'll be our system going forward. It may change. So it's hard to say, but I think, we're looking throughout our process. I think the goal would be that we would have that answer figured out in advance, right? So folks could go to full implementation in 2027, but we are definitely mindful of the nuances of our system and how it tracks data and how it tracks demographics and the limitations that currently exist that make it hard to do that as well. So, it's hard to say where we'll be in 27, but that's something that the working group will have to also figure out and help us with as well as our own staff and have some conversations internally about SSIS capabilities, enhancements, and how they best do it makes sense to better capture that data. And then also a practice of how do you then ask those things? How do you ask about culture for families? It's a little challenging. So don't have an actual answer yet, but I think that's where we're going right now, and that's kind of where we're at in our space.
All right. Question from Tiffany. What is going to be DCYF's capacity or plan to help with counties with phase-in for 2027? Would it look similar or different from work in Hennepin and Ramsey?
Yeah, I think in an ideal world, we would love to have something similar. I think the reality is staff capacity, and time. I think looking at, obviously 85 other counties is a little challenging than the time wise than it is for two counties, but certainly recognize that there's going to be need for help for these counties and don't want to leave them, on the island, so to speak. So I think we're definitely exploring that. I don't know what it look like yet. I think certainly with this work, we may need to add more staff as well on our part to facilitate something. Maybe it's regional meetings that we have in certain areas with with pockets of counties. That we probably can't go every county. Every county is different. Sometimes they have far less kids in other counties too. So I think we're definitely exploring what it might look like, and certainly want to have some conversation with counties on their end as to what it might look for them and how we can build together.
All right. And the last question I have is from Alicia. How is the voice and experience of the frontline workers being taken into consideration during this process, particularly those who have been navigating these changes in Hennepin and Ramsey?
Yeah, that's a great question. I really can't speak to that. I don't quite know, to be honest. It is a very good question. I recognize the voices of workers and how it impacts them as well. I think that in some parts other work, kind of more the smaller scale parts, definitely as our agency has done our work, we've always tried to engage workers in different areas of our work. But in terms of the overall kind of broader leadership level of this, I can't speak to how him and Ramsey are engaging the workers. And I'm not saying they're not. I just don't know how they're doing it. So it's a question we can certainly ask at leadership meetings that we can maybe ask them and see, but I just can't speak to how they are engaging their workers.
All right. Thank you, Devin. That's all the questions I'm seeing in the Q&A.
I see one from, I see a couple more still on my end. I don't know if there's any, I
Okay,
see,
go ahead.
yeah. I see one from Suzanne. Hello, Suzanne. About the ramp up in 27 and then how quickly is the time ramp up? It's a great question. With the phase in ramp up, that was totally on the counties. And so we didn't set a time, we didn't give them any instructions. They developed that themselves. And we just said, okay. And we brought that to our leadership and our agency leadership and said, could this work? And is this in the scope of what we think the bill's asking for? Based on our authority and our oversight, and then we consulted with legal to make sure that was correct. And so we didn't set it. I think to your point, I think in my mind, every county has to figure out what makes sense for them in their capacities. I think that there has to be some concessions to a point to make sure counties can do this effectively and successfully. So I think that, every county may vary. Some counties may be at a position to do this, at 50% start and go up very quickly. Some others might need more time. So I think it's a discussion we'll have to have, county by county as well, and how that works. And that process is not defined yet. So, but yeah, we didn't set the amounts or timelines. Counties did on their own. Um,
Let's see. I think I can see the other ones you were
okay.
talking about, Devin. This one's from Anne. When will counties be provided those definitions of culture, disability, and low income? Will that come out of the work group or will DCIYF provide this definition?
Yeah, I don't have a time frame for it yet. Where we are diligently working on it right now, to figure it out and try to get some traction on this. It's a little challenging because obviously it's such a broad thing. I think disability is a little simpler. There's some precedents we can use, but culture is kind of wide open. So I think obviously our goal is to have that probably within the first report. I would imagine. So maybe the next 6 months, 4 or 5, 6 months. I would say is a timeline that we're shooting for, but it's hard to say. Because it is so broad and it is so um, it allows for so much interpretation too, right, going forward. And so I think we need to have some consistent way to create and some consensus too. But our goal is that it would be, well in advance of obviously the statewide implementation date as well. And of course, if we do get a definition, then we also look at how do we then make adjustments in SSIS to then track that differently as well.
All right. It looks like I missed one from Jody.
Jody,
When
yeah.
will the remaining cases currently excluded, such as applicability based upon culture, disability, and low income status, be included in the phase-in program?
Yeah, I think it's kind of the same question a little bit. I think the
Yeah.
same answer. Yeah, so I would say that. I hope that answered your question. But yeah, and I recognize, I will say I validate and recognize, the importance of this being determined and defined for counties so they can figure out on their ends how they move forward. I totally want to acknowledge that it is a need that's out there, and we are not by any ways trying to minimize that need or trying to delegitimize that need as well. And so it's just a little challenging to figure out what is the definition, right? And how does it work and how to make sure we're not mixing anything. And our goal also is to make sure we don't have something that's also inherently exclusionary too, by creating a definition that's also too streamlined, too narrow, that other folks who may be in the system that are overrepresented are also excluded from that process. So trying to be mindful of that as well.
Great. This question is from Amy. How can a pilot program with the two counties with the highest ability to pay for changes be an accurate pilot for out-of-state counties that are already underfunded. If the pilot
Yeah.
counties have extra funding available to them to help them implement this program, that is not a real-world comparison of the ability of non-pilot counties to implement the act. If 90+% of families in the Child Welfare Act are low income, doesn't that mean, in essence, that the act will apply to every family in the child welfare system?
Yeah, I'll answer the first part, the last part first. Yeah, I mean, it's our intention, our kind of assessment that we think that this will cover a significantly majority part of the system as looking at the definition, especially when you look at culture, which is going to be so broad, and so open for interpretation. So I think absolutely that this will cover most kids in the system for the most part, right? I think with some minor exceptions here and there. We've kind of expressed that to we brought that up to list of authors. Our job as an agency is to implement bills as written, but we recognize those challenges and those dynamics as well. And I don't disagree. I think that we are trying to find ways to best support um, all counties, right? I think your point about him and Ramsey and kind of the other thing is also well taken too. Again, we didn't write the bill, so we had to find ways to implement it going forward. And sometimes I can't speak to why that was chosen, why that was determined. But I think your broader point is valid, and we're looking at to that point, how do we look at the information in a more equitable way across the state to make sure that we don't kind of miss things, we don't have these gaps and evaluations that then impact smaller counties, right? That we have overlooked, and so we're being very mindful of that. That each county is different, each county has different needs, resources, structures, and we can't always compare apples to apples per se. And so we're very mindful of that, and that's something that we want to make sure also is brought up in the working group. I would expect and hope that that same point is going to be brought up by the MAAFPCWDA and the AMCs and the MICAs out here to help that point be continuously lifted up as a real point of consideration and focus. But I agree with your points on it, and I think they're well taken.
All right, and the final question here from Haley. When or how can workers get information on the checklist or best practice guides on how this will be implemented?
Yeah, so a couple of things. There is a you all don't know. I was gonna put it in the PowerPoint, but I didn't get a chance to add it. But there is a MAAFPCWDA public facing kind of information page that exists. I would imagine we can send out to the group as a link as well. That is a place that we can go to and see updates, see things that are happening with the work that we're doing at every level. And then I think as practice guides and guidance and the things that are out there, we'll certainly create spaces to share that as well with leadership, with counties, to make sure that workers are aware of the opportunities that come about from training to practice guides, to webinars, to community practice and all the above. So I think we're still working on refining that, but certainly we're making it a point to be more public facing with our counties partners to make sure they're aware of all things that are coming down the road that may help them with their work going forward, 27.
Great. Thank you so much, Devin, for sharing this information today. I did put in the Q&A before people leave for regular updates on MAAFPCWDA. Please subscribe to our e-list that I put in the chat. So if you're interested in getting regular, we're hoping for weekly updates. Please subscribe to that, and that's our main point of communication to everyone at this point. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Have a great day.